The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody in Queensland and local government land. Welcome to Unit 2, which is the 4 stages of team development. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. So could you please just go to the question box and just type in clear? I just need to know that I'm coming across loud and clear so that I'm not talking to myself. So could you just type in clear, the word clear? That would be great. Okay, thanks, Kerry. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, John. Thanks, Tracy. Okay, sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is always reassuring. Okay, so it was 2 weeks ago that we met previously in the program, and let's just recap on the program and where we're up to. So we talked 2 weeks ago on the characteristics of high-performing teams. And you might recall that there were 8 characteristics. I'll just briefly remind you of those 8 characteristics. And today, of course, we're going to talk about the 4 stages of team development. And I won't go through all the other units that we're covering, but all of them, of course, are about developing high-performing teams. So let's just spend a little bit of time going back over what we went over 2 weeks ago. So what I'd be keen to know is how you're going with these characteristics. So your homework, as you might recall, was to take 1 or 2 of these characteristics and develop them. So the other argument about the model, of course, is that all of these characteristics are interrelated. So if you're not doing one thing, it's highly likely that it'll impact on something else. So for example, if you're not communicating openly in your team, it's highly likely that trust and mutual respect are probably going to be at a low ebb. Or alternatively, if trust and mutual respect is at a low ebb, it's likely that open communication is not going to occur. So the important thing I think we've learned out of all of that is that there's the dimensions of what you should be aiming for. And of course, there's work to be done in each of those dimensions. But the good news for you is that once you work on one of those dimensions, you're likely to impact on the other dimensions. And really, that's the good news because they are all interrelated. For the purposes of just understanding it, we've broken them up into 8 particular dimensions, but they're highly interrelated, of course, and should be. All right, so I hope you've had some success with that. Good, thanks, Edward. I'm hearing you loud and clear. That's good to hear. Okay, so let's move on. There are 4 things that I want to cover today, and basically I want to look at what are the 4 stages of team development. Now, I'm going to use a very well-known model that some of you may be aware of, Tuckmans stages of team development. Barry Tuckman was the first person to come to indicate what the various stages that teams would go through in their maturity and development, and we're going to look at those. And I'm well aware in local government that you may well be in a situation where you've been with a team for a long period of time at the one end of the continuum, and there'd be some of you who might be new into your leadership role, and that might be one of the reasons that you're doing this Lunch and Learn program, and you're needing to learn some skills on how to develop the team. And then there's probably many of you right in the middle somewhere that really, you've been with a team for a little while, but not for a long time. So one of the keys for you to work out is which of the 4 stages that Tuckman identifies, which of the 4 stages is your team in, and more importantly, what can you do to move them on to the next stage? So what are the characteristics of each stage? So it's one thing knowing these 4 stages, it's quite another thing to be able to understand the characteristics of them. And so we're going to spend a bit of time on that. And in particular, the third point there that's on your screen is, what are we going to do about it? So what are you as a team leader going to do at each stage that'll make a big difference? So that's really what we're on about today. As usual, if you've got questions or you've got comments or you've got observations, could I ask you to use the question box there, type in your question. Remember, I'm the only one that sees the question, and then I'll be more than happy to stop the presentation because I'll be expecting some of your questions and comments, and I'll respond to it. That way we can make this as interactive as possible. The other important thing is that you'll receive from me early next week a copy of the slides, and you'll also get a copy of the recording as well, so that so I just want you to relax, and you don't need to take too many notes. It's really just a question of absorbing the concepts, and then when you get the information later, you can perhaps put together a bit of a plan. And I'm encouraging you to do some things differently, because these programs are only as effective as, you know, the degree to which people who are participants are willing to make changes after being exposed to these sorts of concepts. So if you do nothing, of course, you really probably haven't got any value from the program because you haven't put anything into practice. All right, so let's have a look at high-performing teams. Now, obviously, the whole program, the Lunch and Learn series, is about developing high-performance teams or high-performing teams. So what I thought I'd do to start with is, let's just recap and let's just get some sort of a definition about what a high-performing team is. Now, I've come across high-performing teams in local government. I must admit they're not a common occurrence, but then again, they're not a common occurrence anywhere in the world. But when you come across them, it's tremendous to see, and you can see enormous achievement being made. But when I come across them, I would probably come across this, and I'm just going to share with you what my definition of a high-performing team is. So to me, a high-performing team is a small number of people. Now, that's important because the argument is, if you get more than 15 in your team, it's not really a team. So what it means is that you've probably got two sub-teams. So it's a small number of people with complementary skills who are committed to the common purpose, performance goals, and common approach for which they hold themselves accountable. To me, that's a high-performing team. So complementary skills, so the skill set perhaps is diverse, so it means that we can draw upon people's skill level at different points. They are all committed to a common purpose, and whatever that might be, whatever your team's common purpose is, everybody's rowing in the same direction, that they're clear about what performance looks like, and that they're all prepared to use a common approach. And the common approach in local government is very important because the fact of the matter is it is very much a compliance-driven organisation, and we expect people to do things in a certain way. And of course, we want people to feel a sense of accountability for the team output as well as their own accountability. Now, that's not always the case, but it is very important that people hold themselves accountable for their own work, and they hold themselves accountable for the work of the team. The opposite of that, of course, is finger pointing, blame, shifting, responsibility, criticising. We've all seen that before in local government, and it's not very pleasant, and it's certainly not characteristic of a high-performing team. Which, incidentally, I might point out to you that if one of your team members is criticising and you're within earshot, then find an opportunity to pull them aside and challenge them on that. Put a strong case that that's not the way we want things to be here. All right, now they might think that they're perfectly valid in their criticism, but there are many, many ways of being able to resolve a problem without just sitting there and criticising what's going on. It's the easy way out. And I think as a team leader, if you don't do that, you're creating a problem for yourself down the track. So just something that you might like to to give some thought to. So that's my definition of a high-performing team. You may have a different definition. I don't know how that resonates with you. And those of us that have been lucky enough to work in a high-performing team, it's a great thing. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But it doesn't just happen. You don't just get a group of people that click and there it is. Despite the sort of rhetoric that's out there, it requires a fair bit of work to get to a point where you're a high-performing team. So it's not just something where a couple of people come together and it just clicks. That's too simplistic. Now, let's move on to these 4 stages of team development. Now, for some of you, of course, you would have learnt about this somewhere. I'm sure you've seen it, but the important point is not so much whether you know it, but it's more about whether you're applying it, the same with any knowledge. So let's have a look at the 4 stages, and then once I've looked at the 4 stages, I want to then talk about what you as a leader can do at each of those 4 stages. Now, the good news for you is that these 4 stages are very observable in any team. And because I've been trained in this sort of material, I could walk into your team, spend a couple of hours with them, and I could probably categorize them in one of these 4 stages very quickly, because I'd be looking for certain types of behaviours. And it's not so much about you as the team leader, I'm looking for the behaviours of the team in this case. So it is very easy to be able to identify this, and I'll be keen to hear your comments about where you see your team. So if we start over, the model starts, you'll notice that there's an axis called effectiveness of the team. So the higher the point, the green line, the more effective the team is. And down the bottom you've got the performance of the team, which is more or less the length of time the team's been together. So if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the very first stage in any team development is the forming stage. This is where everybody comes together. It's a new team. Everyone's feeling their way and so forth. So the forming takes place. And a lot of cases, of course, in local government, it's often the case where you've got an individual coming into a team rather than a new team being established. But nevertheless, there is a time when new teams do develop, but irrespective of when they do, they develop they develop in that stage. Edward's got a question here. Does high performance require team's ability ready to listen and understand and not just reply? Yeah, I agree. I think a high performing team is where people will be able to have robust discussions. They'll be able to put things on the table without fear or favour. They'll be able to discuss things in an open, honest and authentic way, and that people will accept that as being open, honest and authentic. So I think whenever you've got something that's, when people are sitting back and they're thinking, I won't say this because it might upset so-and-so, or people might think that I'm a silly so-and-so if I say this, when you get those sorts of people thinking that in the team, then I would argue that that's the opposite of a high-performing team. So you're trying to develop a lot of authenticity and give people a chance to have a platform to say what they want. That's not going to happen overnight. It does take a bit of time to do that. So hopefully, Edward, I would suggest to you that it is really around people's readiness to listen and understand and not just reply. Absolutely agree with that. So forming stage 1, and you'll notice the next stage is a big dip in the green line because we're now at the storming stage. Now, the storming stage, and it's pretty self-explanatory what stage that gets to, the storming stage is where there is power struggles within the team. You as the team leader are being challenged internally by team members. There are perhaps other people who are, creating alliances or cliques in their team. Now, you see this a lot in councils, don't you? I do a lot of work with councils in Queensland local governments, and it's very much the case that for the whole term, they never get out of the storming stage, which is quite depressing for you as an officer of the council and for many, many others, including the community. And the public, of course, aren't particularly, they're not favourably predisposed to that sort of thing, and they'll often chuck out a lot of the councillors the next time round if they can't get out of that storming phase, which, you know, is a real issue. So storming there, and then we move to norming. Now norming means that we've increased our performance, but it's not really necessarily where it needs to be. So this is people going about their work, but really they're not doing it with any great sense of urgency or commitment, but they're getting things done. I think there are a lot of teams in local government that get stuck in the norming phase. And I guess what I'm trying to do is to help you guys all get your teams to the final phase, which is the performing phase. So there's a big difference between the norming and the performing. And the performing stage is where people are, you know, achieving optimal performance, whereas in the norming stage, it means that just perhaps doing the minimum acceptable standard of performance. So there is a bit of a difference there, and you'll know yourself, you could probably tell very easily whether your team is in the norming or the forming. Now, you may well be in the storming stage, but hang in there, because the good news is it's a normal, natural part of team development, but the bad news is that you have to do something about it. It's not going to just naturally resolve itself, despite what you might think. So there's the 4 stages, and now what I want to do is talk a little bit more specifically about these 4 stages and what you could possibly do as a leader to influence each of those 4 stages in terms of moving the team on, because we want everyone over here in the performing stage, but that's not going to happen straight away, despite what you might think. It's highly unlikely to occur. Now, if you're lucky enough to be leading a high-performing, you know, they're in the 4th stage team, I'd be very keen to hear your comments in the question box there later and tell us what actually happens. So let's have a look at the forming stage. The forming stage is where the team acts as individuals. There is a lack of clarity about the team's purpose and individual roles. So there's a bit of confusion about who does what. There's a bit of overlapping in terms of who does what. Everyone's pretty much focused on making sure that they dot I's and cross T's in relation to their job description, but nothing more happens. And so when people come into a new team, they feel quite insecure because they think to themselves, one of the ways I can get some brownie points here is to make sure that I follow to the letter of my job description exactly what's there. So they're very focused on the individual effort rather than team effort. So if you've got a bunch of individuals running around doing their own thing and no one really communicating with each other, you're probably in that early stages of forming. Now, shortly we'll talk about what you need to do in order to get them moving on to the next stage, which is storming. So let's have a look at storming. And I've done this one up in red because, for the obvious reason, it's probably the least pleasant of all 4. Although I must admit I've often found the forming or the norming stages a little frustrating as well. But essentially what happens at the storming phase is that conflict arises as people begin to establish their place in the team. So a little bit of argy-bargy, people checking out and looking for their, you know, what they can and can't do. There's a little bit of conflict that goes on in team meetings. And I don't mean constructive conflict necessarily. This is the sort of there are power struggles going on at all times. Now, if you as a leader don't do something in this particular stage, it's quite possible that you could remain in this stage for a long period of time, which isn't helpful. But even if you do something, you may not get the result that you want. And the reason for that is it may not be your fault, that you might have somebody in the team. I do remember working, it'll remain nameless of course, I remember working with a council in Queensland. That's all I'll say. That's as specific as I'll say. But in this council, it was interesting that one of the persons just wasn't going to play. So they were going to be counter everything. Every suggestion the mayor came up with, every suggestion the majority of councillors came up with, they would object to that. Now, that's interesting because that was the platform of which they got elected. So they were elected in a smallish community. They were elected because they were going to hold the council accountable. That was their argument. So it sounded quite positive. But of course, they took that to heart and really played the role to an extent where they really did not want to be a team player. And in fact, there was a small clique of 2 or 3 people out of, I think, probably, as I recall, about 6 or 7 councillors. And this, of course, they were in a minority, but they were able to destabilise a lot of the debate that went on in the chamber. So that team never actually moved from the storming stage for the full term of council. And of course, the mayor, as we know, under the Local Government Act, has very limited powers in terms of what they can do in those sort of circumstances. So mayor was still the team leader in that case, but had very little authority to do anything. So it can happen at any level in council as such. So, all right, so I'm just checking for questions at this stage. No, all good. Let's just, there we go. The next stage is the norming stage. Now, I must admit, I have found this frustrating at different times, but the norming stage, norm meaning normal or median or whatever you want to call it, this is the level of consensus and agreement with it. There's a level of consensus and agreement with a team. There's some clarity about people's individual roles, but there's certainly no great stretch to go to the next level. So it's pretty much a team that's coasting along, getting its work done, not having too much camaraderie between team members, but pretty much not doing anything out of the ordinary. And again, you can find you could end up with a team there, unless you do something differently, you could end up with a team there for a considerable period of time. What we're really interested in, of course, is getting people to this stage. This is the performing stage. And this is where, the team has a clear strategy and a clear vision. They're very clear and very focused on what they need to do. It can almost operate autonomously, and it can resolve issues positively. In other words, whether you're there or not, the team will tend to achieve. Of course, it's the best phase to be in as a team leader because you don't have a huge amount to do. The team runs itself. The team is autonomous, and that's why it's high performing. Of course, you're a member of that team as well, but really your job, your work is pretty easy at that point, because not only is their commitment level high, their skill level's high as well. And so this is important to think about as well as a dimension. Is your team's commitment level, on the one hand, how would you rate that on a scale of 1 to 10? And how would you rate your team level of competence as well on a scale of 1 to 10? That might vary, of course, but overall. So there's the 4 stages. Now, of course, since Tuckman brought this model out, there was another stage called adjoining, the ending of a team, but these were his original 4 stages before other people started to take it to the next level. All right, so we just got a question here, which I'll respond to. In remote Aboriginal Shire councils, the elected members are a challenge getting past the storming stage for CEO while overseeing the operations of council. Yeah, I'm not aware of it as much as you are, Edward, but I can imagine that would be an interesting and frustrating set of circumstances for you as CEO to try to work with a council that's really remains in that storming stage. It's very difficult, and it may well be that the mayor may not have the skills to be able to move the team from the storming to the norming stage, and it often becomes difficult. But even if the mayor did have those skills, sometimes it's a case that you've got some antagonists who are in that council, and they are there and they see it as a badge of honour for them to disrupt proceedings, which is kind of sad. So I understand that that's not always easy, and I understand that it's not always easy because you technically are not a member of that team, although of course you've got to work closely with the team. You're appointed by that team. But I think what I would say to you is that all you can do is work with what you might have some control over, which is your senior team, to try to get them galvanised, and working together is pretty important, I would have thought. All right, but thanks nevertheless for the question and the comment. Let's move on. Now, what this model shows you is those 4 stages in a kind of like a stepping stone process. And what you'll notice is it says at each of these stages, there is a set of behaviours which are at the bottom that the team exhibits, and the leadership action that will move the team to the next level. So what I want to do now is concentrate on what you might see and observe in terms of the behaviours and where you could actually identify your team to be, and what task you as the leader might implement in order to get them from that stage to the next stage. So in the forming stage, the concern is there that people making contact, they may not know each other that well, they might be unfamiliar. So in a small community, of course, that's probably not going to be an issue. They're going to want to develop some trust, and they're going to want to be dependent on their team. So there's a whole lot of issues around that. The team is feeling its way early on in its early formation. So what I think it's really important for you as a team leader, or if you're the leader of a team at that early stages, you need to establish some ground rules early. And it's very important to do this. So what are your values? What are the top 2 or 3 values that are critically important to you? You have every right to put those on the table, and you have every right to communicate what those values are to the rest of your team. In fact, I'd say you not only have a right to do it, you have a responsibility to do it. Now, why? Because people are searching for some boundaries. They're searching for what it means being led by you. And never underestimate the level of anxiety that there is when a new team leader comes in. People often don't talk about it openly, but there's a lot of anxiety because they're wondering whether they can work with you or not. So in order to neutralize that anxiety, it's important to share with people what you see as the common ground and what you see as the critical incidents. So for example, I might come into a team and I'm new. Now, when I come into a team new as a team leader, you could virtually say that the team's back to the forming stage, even if it's been going for a period of time. So I might sit down with that team and I might say to them, look, there's 2 values that are critically important to me. One of those values is promise what you deliver, and another one of those values is respect, as in give people an opportunity to have a say even if you disagree. So whatever it might be, and I put those things on the table, and then I might give some examples, and I'm going to then look at everything that's done in those early stages of my team leadership through the prism of those 2 values, so that people are not only seeing you lead by the task, they're also seeing you lead by a set of values. So that's a simple thing. And then when you get to the storming stage, and it's inevitable it'll happen, by the way, folks, there's nothing you can do, you can't avoid it. It's part and parcel with a group of people getting together as human beings. So this is where people flex their muscles, and they're actually expressing differences of ideas and feelings and opinions. They're reacting to you as the leader. They're testing you out. the members can often be independent or counter-dependent. So once a team's starting to form, you could get a minority of people who are trying to undermine the team. And I found that happened quite a lot when I was in the corporate world, that people would undermine the work that I was trying to do because we were actually in that storming phase. So people are actively going out of their way to actually destroy, not build a team. And I felt very responsible for that, and I would often pull people aside one-on-one and explain to them firmly that that behaviour is not on, that people had a perfect right to have a view, but not to be undermining the work that I was doing. So they either complied or went underground, one or the other, but often, it was important for me to do that. So for you, you can see there on the screen, you need to identify the power structure. I know there's been a lot of cases around that I've seen where you might get promoted to being a team leader, and somebody in that team has also applied for that job and they've missed out. This is very common in local government, in my view. And they've missed out and they're going to carry a grudge. And because they've missed out, they're going to make your life a misery. And if, in fact, you have been in those circumstances, and of course you could be on the other end too, and you could be the one that missed out and feel quite upset about it. But if you're the team leader and somebody actually had applied for your job and missed out, my strong advice to you is to get with them as quickly as possible after you've been appointed the team leader and have a conversation with them about whether or not that in itself was an issue. Now, I don't mean any sort of accusatory way. You just simply pull the person aside and simply say, look, I can understand you applied for the position, and I can understand that you're probably disappointed you didn't get get the nod, but the reality is it is what it is, and we've got to work together, and I need your commitment to do that. How are you feeling about everything? Just put it on the table. All right, that you'll feel a lot better about that. And I find sometimes team leaders don't feel comfortable doing that, and that just creates enormous stress because it's the elephant in the room. No one's talked about it, so it's really important that you do that. So when we get to the norming stage, this is where you see decisions are being made through some negotiation and consensus, so people are starting to work together, certainly not at an optimal level, but they're certainly starting to work together. You can see it in team meetings. You can see that you're not the only one doing all the talking or one or two minorities, that everybody is in some senses feeling as if they've got something to contribute, but it's not probably where it needs to be. So good team meetings, regular team meetings, are a good gauge about where your team is in these 4 phases. So members agree about roles and processes for problem solving, and your role there is very much to sharpen the distinction between what people should be doing and clarifying with them what they should be doing. So that's important to do that. And then if you are fortunate enough to get to the final stage, and you will if you're doing the right things, the members are working very collaboratively without your hand holding at all. The members they care about each other on a deeper level than just they happen to be work colleagues. The group establishes a unique identity, and in fact anyone outside the team could probably describe what that identity is. And the members are interdependent, so they're very reliant on each other and won't hesitate to call upon each other for advice and so forth. I mean, that's a great situation when you can achieve that. So achieving of satisfying results, members are finding solutions and problems without necessarily your help. So if you've got people relying on you too much, then I'd suggest to you that you're not in the performing stage. I'd probably suggest you may not even be in the norming stage, that you're probably in the forming or storming stages because they're really relying on you too much and not their colleagues or their team members. So there's some thoughts. If you've got any questions, go for your life, because I've thrown a fair bit at you there. So when you're ready, just type in your question. So what I want to do is just pursue this a bit further, and perhaps I just want to make a couple of points about Tuckman's model, which I think is important because it's a linear model, and being a linear model, it has its shortcomings. So here are some interesting thoughts about Tuckman's model. Every group will go through some part of each stage. Okay, so the more the group members know each other and have worked together before, the less time spent in the first 3 stages. So obviously a well-established team, hopefully, will not exhibit many traits in the storming stage. That the challenge then for you will be to move them from norming to performing. That will be the challenge, rather than to get them from, say, from forming to storming. But teams can backslide. People can go in and out of different stages, or sorry, I should say teams can go in and out of different stages. Each stage is critical for team development. It is important to understand that if you could just go straight to the performing stage, that wouldn't necessarily be a good thing, because there are lots and lots of things that are learned in the norming, storming, and forming stages. For example, it helps people clarify what their roles and responsibilities are. It helps people to understand who's who in the team. It helps people clarify who's got the pecking order and the power structure. It helps people to understand what they're responsible for and what they're responsible to. So, you know, the 4 phases actually are there, and they are important for the team overall. The stages often play out simultaneously or in different order, so you can find that, you know, in the course of one day, a team can actually go through 2 or 3 stages and then backslide to another stage. So when you're looking at your team, it's just a convenient tool. Tuckman's model is just a convenient tool for being able to establish where the team is at any particular time and what you might be able to do that might be in the best interest of the team at that time. That's essentially what it means. So a team may start out by storming if the forming stage is not given attention and time. Okay, a team may norm and then storm about another issue or part of a team's charge. So it can change. So I want you, out of today's session, is to watch very carefully how your team likes to operate. Now, with every event, with many events and changes, the process repeats. So, for example, if you have a new team member come in, it's highly likely that the dynamics will change significantly, and that your team will perhaps go back to some of the previous stages. And if you're the team leader, as I mentioned earlier, if you come into an established team as a team leader, and let's say that team's at the performing stage, that will last perhaps for a little while, but everyone will look up and wonder what you're going to be like to work with. And until you can address that, it's probably likely that the team won't remain where it is. So you've got a role to play in all of this. It doesn't just accidentally move from forming to performing. You've got to actually take people through that process as well. All right, so there's 4 key points there that I want you to keep in mind as we go. So now let's spend a little bit more time on each phase, and what I want you to do now is to start to think about what you might be able to do in each phase in order for you to do your job as the leader. So these next few slides are very much focused on you as the leader and what you need to achieve as the leader. So the leader, during the forming stage, your role is to raise awareness. If we had to pick one theme, that's what it would be. What are you raising awareness about? You're raising awareness about standards. You're raising awareness about clarity around job roles. You're raising awareness about how people work together. You're raising awareness about the culture that you want to develop and the values you want to instill in the team. All of that is critically important in that early stage because people don't know. They're not mind readers, and they need to know and they want to know. So your role is that you are very task focused in these early stages. High task, low relationship. The relationships, of course, will develop. The critical thing at this stage is to set the parameters about what your expectations are as a leader. You remember in the last unit, we went through the 7 different questions that have to be asked around expectations. This is classically where this is very important in this early stages of your team leadership. All right, so setting parameters, setting guidelines, establishing values, and all of that kind of thing is critically important in the early stages of your leadership of the team. So what do you need to do? You need to establish values, which is really important. You need to have a clarity of vision. In other words, what's your vision about how this team works? Now, this might be internal, so your team might be a service provider to other sections of council. So the question is, what does your vision look like? How does that going to look? Are you happy with the way it's been done in the past? Do you want to make some changes? Do you want to become more customer focused? And what does that mean if you do? So you've got to answer all those questions in the early stages of the team, because the team is relying on you to tell them, because if you don't tell them, they won't know. And that's not a good thing. Goal setting. So you've got to set some goals and standards. You've got to clarify individual roles and responsibilities. And this requires a little bit of work one-on-one, ironically. So the idea here is for you to spend time individually with each person as well as the team, because a lot of people are struggling with where they fit in the team at this stage. So question here, awareness of compliance, procurement and governance in line with local government requirements, following policies. Yeah, exactly. And it's really important to reiterate what they are. And I might have mentioned this last time, because local government is very compliance driven, it doesn't mean that everything has to comply. Remember, there are 3 different types of decisions. There's the decision around we must follow the rules, we must follow exactly what's in front of us, and that's that. But there's another dimension, which is that we can show initiative at different times. You need to point out when that initiative can be shown. And there are other times where you could either follow the process, in other words, be compliant, or do something a little bit different. Now, that would be a good discussion to have in the early stages of forming around expectations around when to follow the system, when not to follow the system, and when you're in a dilemma where you've got a choice between being compliant and being adaptive. So that would be a classic case where I would be wanting to have a conversation with my team members, and what they're really interested in is my expectations around that. Okay, so once we get to the storming stage, I think a lot of people drop the ball here. I think it's very important that your role during this storming phase is to maintain an adequate production while building team group cohesion. And this requires a high task and a high relationship. You're going to earn your money at this stage because you cannot avoid sweeping it under the carpet. You have to deal with conflict, you have to negotiate, you have to bring groups of people together, you have to do whatever you can. Let me assure you, it will make it worse if you decide not to play. So if you're just thinking, well, this will just ride out, this is just one of the phases that teams go through, I'll let sleeping dogs lie, I won't get engaged, I don't want to open a can of worms. If you adopt that mindset, and many, many leaders in local government do, I can assure you it won't be pretty. And what will happen is it'll actually make this stage not only longer, but more intense as well. So what does that actually mean? for you as a leader? Well, here's some things that you need to do. You need to be listening actively. So in other words, I think the greatest compliment that somebody can give you about your leadership is that you are, you're a good listener. That's a good thing that people should say about you. And I don't mean just faking it, I mean you're just actually good at it. You spend time with people and you do actively engage with people. Really important. So spend time with people one-on-one. Spend time trying to understand their position. Spend time trying to understand where they're coming from. Spend time asking them questions about their positioning. The more interest you show in the other person, the more likely it is that they will show interest in you and your position. But also, I would say to you, be assertive. Now, assertive doesn't mean aggressive. Assertive means for you to stick up for what you believe in and let people know if you don't believe in what they're saying, to let them know. So it's really important to be assertive, okay? So let people know that you won't accept that behaviour, or that that's unreasonable, or I want you to rethink what you've just said. It is important to do that, but to do it with respect is critically important. You need to engage in conflict during this stage because there will be plenty of it. And what you need to do is to try to do everything that you can to try to resolve it, bearing in mind that you may not, all right? Because the fact of the matter is, if there's two people in conflict, there's a responsibility on both parties to solve it. And sometimes one of those people will not take responsibility for that, in which case it's not resolvable. But all you can do is do your best. And of course, during this storming phase, you might need to be quite flexible and creative as well. So there's a lot of things to do at this stage. But if you hold your head up, you're assertive, you don't put up with any nonsense, you're clear about what you expect, it's likely that you'll get through this phase. And if you do, you move into the norming phase, and the theme around the norming phase is cooperation. This is where people are starting to work together in a collaborative or cooperative way. And that's the first surefire sign that you've moved from storming to norming. So what's your role in all this? Well, it's low task and high relationship, believe it or not. What you're trying to do at this stage is promote participation, trying to promote involvement, providing more opportunities for team members to take responsibility. So you're really looking at promoting the relationships amongst team members at this point. And this is very important that you get to this stage as quickly as you can. So, for example, if somebody came up to you and they wanted you to answer a question for them, and you knew that one of their colleagues in the team was just as adept at answering that, you might actually say to them, have you gone and talked to Jack or Jackie? And they say no, and say, well, look, I really suggest you do, because they've got a really good handle on that and I think they know what they're doing. And then just send them on their way. And what I would do is maybe the next day I'd follow that up and say, did you get a chance to talk to Jack or Jackie about the issue that you raised with me? All right? And they say no. Say, well, I really think you should, because I think they've got something to offer. So what you're doing is you're constantly building up the relationships in the team. You're constantly promoting the skill sets and the opportunities to collaborate and cooperate individually and collectively. So what that means for you as a leader is that you should still keep your sense of humour. I think it's important. In fact, in local government, I think a sense of humour is a great thing. It's a really important skill, because, you know, it could get very serious if you're not having a good laugh every now and again. So, you know, be playful, have a sense of humour. Do spend plenty of time at this stage networking with your team members. Make sure that you're working closely with them. And make sure you're promoting involvement so that people feel a sense of how they can be involved and what that looks like. And communication and feedback on performance at this stage is critically important. Why? Because we're at the norming stage, and people need to understand that there's a shortfall between what they're doing and where you want them to be. So the only way you can identify that shortcoming is by giving people regular, timely, and specific feedback, just as we talked about the last session. So of course you're doing that one-on-one. But I also think it's not a bad idea, and I've done this many times with teams over the years, is during one of your team meetings is to actually ask people to rate the team on a scale of 1 to 10. So 10's high, 1's low. Rate the team in terms of its ability to perform its duties and responsibilities. And then ask people to identify or to perhaps justify their rating, and go around the table and listen to what people have to say. This is part of that, moving that team on from the norming to the performing. That can be very powerful. Or another very good technique is to actually ask people, if you had to describe our team as a colour, what would it be? If you had to describe our team as a motor vehicle, what would it be? And if you had to describe our team as an animal, what would it be? Now that's always very interesting, because they've got to find these metaphors around colour, vehicle and animal. And then of course you ask them to explain why. And you'll find this is a very interesting exercise, that the teams will often come up with very similar themes. They may not come up with the exact animal, but they'll come up with the same justifications for the animal that they've selected. And that creates cohesion and understanding and so forth. And you have a listen to what people say. If you're adventurous, you can then say, well, if we could be the ideal vehicle, colour and animal, what would they be? And there'll obviously be a gap between what they said they were and what they are. And then you can throw open the question of what needs to happen for us to move from where we are to where we need to be. And what do you individually have to do, and what do we collectively need to do in order to get from A to B? So they're the sort of skills that you need at this stage. And then of course, if you do that reasonably effectively, you'll get to the performing stage. And the performing stage, what people need most from you is recognition. Why? Well, they need something from you, and really at this stage it's low task, low relationship, and much more delegation. The reason for that is that the team is highly competent and very interdependent. So therefore your job description changes somewhat to more of a mentoring, coaching, delegation, recognition style role. Your job is to problem solve, to plan, to mentor, to coach, and to recognize. Because if you don't do those things, then people may slip back into the norming phase very easily. So you can see that your role as a leader changes as the team changes, and vice versa. As you change, the team changes. And I guess if there's one thing that I wanted you to get out of today's unit is exactly that your leadership style should not be static, and that if it's not static, in other words, you're changing it all the time, it's highly likely that your team will change its approach as well. All right, so I know it sounds very easy in a webinar, and I know it's not quite so simple on the ground, but I want you to have fun with this. I want you to go out of here and perhaps this afternoon just observe your team. And if you feel that some of those things are really worthwhile, then apply them. We're getting towards the end now, folks, so if you've got any questions, please, now's your time to type them in. But you've probably seen the situational leadership model in your past. It's a very good model and stood the test of time. And Blanchard and Hershey put together the model, which is pretty simple, as you can see in front of you. That over on the left-hand side, you've got supportive behaviour, ranging from high to low. And then across the bottom axis, you've got directive behaviour, ranging on the left-hand side from low to high. And so you've got 4 different leadership styles, which Hersey and Blanchard call situational leadership. So they argue that the situation that we're in will require the style or the sort of leadership that you might exhibit. And down the bottom there, you'll notice that it's got D4 right through to D1. So D4 is where you have a high competence level in your team, so the skill level is very high, and a high commitment level. That's as good as it gets. Right through to a low competence level and a low commitment level, which is obviously as bad as it gets. So what you can do then is you can see that you've got 4 different styles of leadership. You've got delegating, supporting, coaching, and directing. And the argument is that you should be using those 4 styles of leadership more and more readily. So for example, in the forming stage, because people aren't sure of what's happening and how it's all going to unfold and what you're like to lead, you need to be fairly directive. And by directive, I don't mean become an autocrat. I mean simply explaining to people what your expectations are, how you want things done, setting up, role descriptions, explaining what people's jobs titles mean and so forth. Then as the team matures, we can then start to coach them, which means that we can just take a little less directive role, although it's still reasonably directive, but that coaching is the best style during that storming phase that I mentioned earlier on. And then when you get to the norming phase, you can start to being more supportive. All right, so this is the one-on-one conversations and your involvement with other people if and when they require your need and involvement. And then at this performing stage, your job should be pretty much around delegating everything so that other people can get on and get the job done at the time. So I think situational leadership model is a great way of explaining the different leadership styles that we need to exhibit at different points. All right, some other issues around Tuckman that are important before we finish up. Adjournment after a project's completed, the team needs to formally close down, and often there's a lot of mourning that goes with that because the team's been through a lot together, and you see this a lot, and it's timely to talk about Anzac Day because it's coming up, and what you find is that the people come together again who were working in great teams years ago, and they're reliving those experiences. That's part of the deal. A change in the team members will reset the team process. So it is important for you to realise that every time you have a new person in your team, the dynamics of your team change significantly. So that's something that's very interesting for me to observe. So it's very important for you to make sure that you have systems in place for that to occur. And then getting through the formation process requires leadership from you and team members being persistent and conscious about working on team issues. So for you to be successful to develop the team through these 4 stages, you basically need to be tenacious. You need to continue the work because it won't just happen automatically. It is hard work. Building teams is hard work, and it's the work of leadership. All right, which brings us to the end. Your homework is to adjust your leadership style to accommodate the stage that you're in the team development. So I'd like you to have a think about where your team is. I'd like you to have a think about what you might do in order for you to lead that team in that situation. And I'd like you to implement what you've learned. And if you feel comfortable, I'd like you to come back and tell me how you went. In other words, this is the experimental phase. I want you to try a few things and come back and tell me. So folks, that's pretty much it. I don't see any other questions there. We're up to next time we meet, we'll talk about some tools for leading teams, and I'll go through that in detail with you and share with you some more practical tools. But at this stage, I just want you to start to change and alter your leadership style dependent on what the team itself needs in order to be effective. All right, so thanks guys. I've enjoyed working with you again, and have a great weekend, and we'll see you in a fortnight. Thank you.